How Alexander the Great Forged an Empire from a Dream. Introduction. The Boy Who Saw the Shadow. History is not always forged in the thunder of 1,000 hooves or the clash of bronze on bronze. Sometimes, the seed of an empire, the very essence of a leader who will reshape the world, is revealed in a moment of quiet observation. For Alexander the Great, that moment came not on a battlefield, but in a dusty courtyard in Macedonia, before a horse. The horse was Bucephalus, a magnificent black stallion, enormous and powerful, with a spirit as wild as the mountains from which he came. He was a gift for Alexander's father, King Philip II, but the gift was a dangerous one. The horse was a fury of flailing hooves and furious snorts, throwing every experienced rider who dared approach him. Frustrated and seeing the animal as useless, Philip ordered him taken away, likely to be destroyed. But from the crowd of men who saw only rage, a boy's voice cut through the tension. It was Philip's son, Alexander, then only 12 years old. He asked for a chance to try where seasoned warriors had failed. He had been watching, not the riders, but the horse. He had seen what no one else had. The magnificent creature was not wild with uncontrollable rage, but frantic with a primal fear. Bucephalus was terrified of his own dancing shadow. This was the moment of insight that defined a life. Leadership is not always about overpowering a challenge. It is about understanding it. Alexander approached the stallion not with a whip, but with a new perspective. He took the reins, spoke softly and calmly, turned the horse's head to face the sun, so its terrifying shadow fell behind it, unseen. The fear vanished. The boy then stroked the great beast, and with a single, fluid motion, sprang onto its back. The horse that had been untamable was now tamed. Alexander galloped back to his weeping, astonished father, who declared that Macedonia was too small for him. That day, Alexander gained more than a horse. He gained a companion that would carry him into battle for most of his life. But more importantly, he demonstrated the foundational principle of his genius. His unique power was his ability to see the shadow, the hidden fear in an enemy's formation, the unseen opportunity in a difficult landscape, the root cause of a problem that others only fought at the surface. This singular ability to perceive the true nature of a challenge and turn a perceived weakness into a decisive strength was the skill that would allow him to transform a grand vision into the largest empire the world had ever known. Part I. The Forging of the Hammer. Alexander's vision did not spring from a vacuum. He inherited a weapon, a kingdom, and a plan, all forged in the crucible of his father's relentless ambition. When Philip II came to the throne in 359 BCE, Macedonia was a kingdom on the precipice of oblivion. It was less a unified state than a collection of feuding clans, dismissed by the sophisticated city-states to the south as a semi-barbarous frontier. The kingdom was surrounded, with Illyrian raiders to the north, having just slaughtered Philip's brother, and 4,000 Macedonian warriors, Paeonians raiding from another direction, and Thracian tribes pressing on its borders. In this moment of crisis, Philip demonstrated a mastery of statecraft that would define his reign. He used diplomacy and outright bribes to buy off his most dangerous neighbors, securing precious time. He then used that time not merely to rebuild, but to revolutionize. Philip understood that to survive, Macedonia could not just be strong, it had to be invincible. His first masterstroke was profoundly practical. He transformed the very nature of warfare. While the Greek states relied on part-time citizen soldiers who fought when called, Philip created a professional, standing army that lived and breathed combat. The centerpiece of this new military machine was the Macedonian phalanx, armed with a terrifying new weapon, the sarissa. This was a pike of 18 to 21 feet, nearly twice the length of a traditional Greek spear. When deployed by the disciplined phalanx, the sarissæ created a dense forest of spear points, an iron hedgehog that was impenetrable to enemy infantry and made cavalry charges suicidal. But Philip's genius was in coordination. While the phalanx acted as a great anvil, holding the enemy in place, his elite companion cavalry, the hetairoi, acted as the hammer, comprised of Macedonian nobles and typically led by the king himself. This heavy cavalry force would strike a decisive, lightning-fast blow against the enemy's flank or rear. This combined arms tactic, integrating heavy infantry, cavalry, and light skirmishers, was a deadly art form, decades ahead of its time. With this revolutionary army, funded by his seizure of the gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeum, Philip systematically expanded his power. He intervened in the sacred war in central Greece, gaining prestige and a foothold in Hellenic affairs. Through a relentless combination of war, diplomacy, and strategic marriages, he subjugated the surrounding tribes and brought the fractious Greek city-states under his control. The culmination of this effort was the decisive Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where Philip crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. He then established the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states that named him hegemon, or supreme commander, for a great pan-Hellenic project, the invasion of the Persian Empire. The official justification for this grand war was revenge for the Persian king Xerxes' invasion of Greece a century and a half earlier. However, Philip's true motivations were far more pragmatic. The vast wealth of Persia was needed to pay for his expensive professional army, and a great foreign war was the perfect tool to unite the perpetually squabbling Greeks against a common enemy, preventing them from turning on him. This created a political and military engine that required constant expansion to sustain itself. A professional army must be paid and kept busy, or it becomes a threat to its own master. The invasion of Persia was therefore not just an opportunity. It was a structural necessity to maintain the very system Philip had built. By the time of his assassination in 336 BCE, Philip had already sent an advance force of 10,000 men into Asia Minor under his trusted general, Parmenion. Alexander inherited not just an army, but a fully formed blueprint for conquest. Yet, if Philip forged the hammer, it was the philosopher Aristotle who polished the mind that would wield it. From the age of 13 to 16, Alexander was tutored by the greatest intellectual of the age. This education was the critical element that elevated him from a mere warlord to a world-changing visionary. Aristotle instilled in him a deep love of philosophy, medicine, and scientific investigation, as well as a profound appreciation for Greek culture, inspired by the heroic tales of Homer. This unique synthesis of might and mind is what made Alexander unstoppable. Philip gave him the physical means to conquer the world, but Aristotle gave him a philosophical framework for what to do with it once conquered. As Alexander himself is said to have declared, "I am indebted to my father for living, but to my teacher for living well." Part 2. The Vision Unleashed, a World in Motion. In the spring of 334 BCE, at the age of 21, Alexander took the hammer his father had forged and prepared to strike Asia. He crossed the Hellespont, leading the combined forces of the League of Corinth on what he masterfully framed as a great pan-Hellenic war of revenge. This was not just an invasion, it was a propaganda campaign designed to legitimize his leadership over all of Greece. After an initial victory at the Granicus River against local Persian governors, he would face his first true test against the full might of the Persian Empire and its king, Darius III. First strike, the Battle of Issus. In 333 BCE, Darius III executed a brilliant strategic maneuver, marching his grand army around the Amanus mountain range to position himself behind Alexander's forces. This move cut the Macedonian supply lines and forced Alexander to turn and fight on ground of Darius's choosing. However, Darius made a fatal error. He chose to confront Alexander on a narrow coastal plain near the town of Issus, a strip of land wedged between the mountains and the sea. This terrain completely neutralized his overwhelming numerical advantage, as he could not deploy his vast army to its full width and envelop the smaller Macedonian force. The battle that followed was a showcase of Alexander's audacious leadership and tactical clarity. He took personal command of the right flank, at the head of his elite companion cavalry. The battle raged, and at a critical moment, the Macedonian center, a phalanx of hardened veterans, began to struggle against a formidable line of Greek mercenaries fighting for the Persians. Seeing his line buckle, Alexander did not hesitate. He dismounted and, on foot, personally led his elite infantry, the hypaspists, in a ferocious charge that punched a hole through the enemy line. This was the turning point. Remounting his horse, Alexander wheeled his companions and led a direct, headlong charge straight for the center of the Persian line, where Darius himself stood in his war chariot. This was Alexander's signature strategy, not to defeat the army, but to decapitate its command. The psychological shock of seeing Alexander and his elite cavalry thundering towards him was too much for the Persian king. A stunned Darius III turned his chariot and fled the battlefield in a panic. The flight of the king triggered a complete and catastrophic collapse of the Persian army. The battle became a rout. Alexander's victory was absolute, a testament to his belief that the courage of the leader is the most decisive weapon of all. Masterstroke. The Battle of Gaugamela. 2 years later, in 331 BCE, Darius made his final stand. He had spent the intervening time gathering a colossal army from every corner of his empire, a force so vast that ancient historians struggled to count it. He chose the battlefield with meticulous care, the wide, flat plains of Gaugamela, perfect ground for his scythed chariots, and his massive superiority in cavalry. This was to be the ultimate contest of numbers versus genius, of brute force versus tactical brilliance. Facing this overwhelming force, Alexander devised a plan of breathtaking ingenuity. On the night before the battle, he let his men rest and eat, while the Persian army, fearing a surprise night attack, remained in formation, standing anxiously for hours and exhausting themselves before the fighting even began. At dawn, Alexander advanced, but not in a straight line. He moved his entire army en echelon, at an angle to the right. This oblique advance was a deliberate provocation. It threatened to envelop the Persian left flank, forcing the Persian cavalry commander, Bessus, to send wave after wave of his horsemen to counter the move. Alexander was not trying to outflank the Persians, he was baiting them. As more and more Persian cavalry were drawn into the escalating fight on the wing, a gap inevitably began to open in the main Persian line, right next to Darius's royal guard at the center. This was the moment Alexander had been manufacturing from his very first step. He had created his opportunity. With perfect timing, Alexander wheeled his companion cavalry, the hypaspists, and 4 battalions of the phalanx into a giant wedge and charged directly into the gap. Once again, he was not fighting the army. He was hunting the king. And once again, the sight of Alexander at the head of a disciplined, unstoppable charge was too much for Darius. He fled, and with his flight, the heart of the Persian army was broken. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the known world for 2 centuries, effectively died on that plain. Alexander had proven his own maxim, "I do not fear an army of lions led by sheep. I fear an army of sheep led by a lion. His repeated success with this strategy of command decapitation reveals a profound understanding of his enemy. The Persian army was a feudal host held together by personal loyalty to the King of Kings. By removing the king, he shattered the army's center of gravity, guaranteeing its collapse. It was a lesson in leverage that military academies still study to this day. Part 3. The Empire of the Mind. Building a New World. After the victory at Gaugamela, Alexander marched into the heartlands of Persia, occupying the great cities of Babylon and Susa. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, he enacted the final scene of his Pan-Hellenic war of revenge. He ceremonially burned down the grand palace of Xerxes, the king who had burned Athens, as a powerful symbol that the mission was complete. He then dismissed his Greek allies, sending them home laden with treasure. From this point forward, the war was no longer for Greece. It was Alexander's own. His vision expanded from that of a conqueror to that of an emperor, from destroying an old world to building a new one. Cities of tomorrow, the Alexandrian dream. Alexander's ambition was not merely to rule over ruins, but to seed his new empire with centers of culture, commerce, and Greek influence. He founded over 20 cities that bore his name, from Alexandria ad Isum on the Mediterranean coast to Alexandria Arachosia in modern-day Afghanistan. These were not just military outposts. They were strategic nodes in a vast network designed to project Hellenic culture deep into Asia. They were populated with Greek veterans and local peoples, creating new cosmopolitan hubs where East and West could meet. This strategy reveals a remarkably modern understanding of power. Long-term control is maintained not just by garrisons, but by building an interconnected network of economic and cultural influence. The crown jewel of this network was Alexandria in Egypt. Founded in 332 BCE on a strip of land between the sea and a lake, perfectly situated to become the commercial hub of the Mediterranean, Alexander envisioned it as the new capital of his empire, a perfectly planned Hellenic metropolis designed by the architect Dinocrates. Though Alexander would not live to see it completed, his vision was realized by his successor in Egypt, Ptolemy I. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, Alexandria became the largest and most dazzling city in the world, a beacon of learning and innovation, home to the monumental lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the great library, which sought to contain the sum of all human knowledge. It was the physical embodiment of Alexander's dream, a place where the knowledge and cultures of the world could converge. A world remade, the policy of fusion. Alexander's most radical and far-reaching vision was his policy of cultural fusion. He sought to create a harmonious, multicultural empire that would blend Greek and Eastern traditions, forging a new, unified identity. This was, in part, a pragmatic necessity. His relatively small Macedonian army could not hope to rule a vast and diverse empire by force alone. He needed to co-opt the existing Persian administrative structures and win the loyalty of the local elites to govern effectively. The idealism of his vision served a deeply practical purpose. To achieve this, he engaged in powerful symbolic acts. He began to adopt elements of Persian dress and court ceremony, including the controversial practice of proskynesis, or prostration, which angered many of his proud Macedonian veterans who believed such reverence was due only to the gods. In Egypt, he honored the local deities and had himself crowned pharaoh, declaring himself the son of the god Amun-Ra to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the Egyptian people. The ultimate expression of this policy came in 324 BCE at the city of Susa. There, he orchestrated a spectacular mass wedding, a ceremony designed to literally merge the ruling classes of Europe and Asia. Alexander himself took a second wife, Statira, the eldest daughter of the defeated Darius III, symbolically positioning himself as the rightful heir to the Persian throne. At the same time, he compelled thousands of his highest-ranking Macedonian officers and soldiers to marry the daughters of Persian and Median nobles. This was more than a political alliance. It was a deliberate act of social engineering, an attempt to breed a new, unified Greco-Persian aristocracy that would govern his new world. It was a vision of empire built not on subjugation, but on integration. Part 4. The Man Against the Horizon, the Limits of a Dream. Alexander's ambition was boundless. His personal desire, what the Greeks called pathos, was a divine longing to go further, to see more, to reach the ends of the world and the great outer sea. After the conquest of Persia, his campaigns pushed ever eastward into the unknown lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, across the Hindu Kush, and deep into the Indian subcontinent. For years, his army followed him, enduring brutal marches, fighting in unfamiliar climates against fierce new enemies, like the Indian king Porus and his war elephants at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Their armor was wearing out, their Greek clothing was gone, and they were forced to wear recut Indian garments. They were weary to the bone. The River of Tears, mutiny at the Hyphasis. In 326 BCE, on the banks of the Hyphasis River, the modern-day Beas in Punjab, Alexander's infinite vision finally collided with the finite reality of human endurance. He announced his intention to march on, to the great Ganges plain, where rumors told of even larger and more powerful Indian kingdoms. For his army, this was the final straw. They had marched to the edge of their known world. They had fought for 8 years, won glory and riches, and survived unimaginable hardships. They were exhausted, homesick, and they would go no further. This was not a disorderly riot, but a collective, resolute act of defiance. An officer named Conus, a respected veteran, spoke for the entire army. He respectfully recounted their toils and losses, reminded Alexander of their unwavering loyalty up to this point, but stated firmly that the men yearned to see their homes and families again. They refused to march on. For Alexander, this was an unthinkable challenge to his will. His authority, which had been absolute on the battlefield, was now being denied by his own men. His initial reaction was one of disbelief and incandescent rage. He delivered a passionate speech, reminding them of their shared glory and the shame of turning back with their conquests incomplete. But for the first time, his charisma failed him. The men stood in sullen, resolute silence. Enraged, Alexander retreated to his tent, where he remained for 3 days in a tense standoff, hoping his army would relent. They did not. The will of the army was unbreakable. Finally, Alexander had to accept the one defeat of his career, a defeat delivered not by an enemy army, but by the love and exhaustion of his own soldiers. He emerged from his tent and, in a masterful act of face-saving leadership, announced that he had performed sacrifices to discern the will of the gods, and the omens were unfavorable for crossing the river. He had decided to turn back. The camp erupted in a roar of joy and relief. Men wept, cheering their king and calling down blessings upon him, for he had allowed himself to be conquered by them and them alone. The mutiny at the Hyphasis was a profound lesson in leadership. It demonstrated that even the most powerful vision must ultimately bend to the human limits of those asked to realize it. It showed that true strength is not just in knowing when to push forward, but also in having the wisdom to know when to listen and turn back. Conclusion: echoes of an empire. Alexander's return journey was arduous, and his drive never slackened, but he would never see Macedonia again. In June of 323 BCE, in the ancient city of Babylon, Alexander the Great fell ill with a fever and died. He was just 32 years old. He left behind the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to India, but he left no viable heir and no clear plan for succession. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, his apocryphal last word was, "Toi kratistoi," to the strongest. It was a prophecy of chaos. His death created an immediate and catastrophic power vacuum. His most powerful generals, the Diadochi, or successors, immediately began to vie for control. What followed was a brutal and tragic 40-year period known as the Wars of the Diadochi. These were not wars of ideology, but of pure ambition. The great commanders who had fought side by side, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Cassander, Lysimachus, turned on one another with ruthless ferocity. Alliances were made and broken, treachery was commonplace, and the dream of a unified empire was torn to shreds in a generation of conflict. Alexander's own family became pawns and then victims in these power struggles. His mother Olympias, his wife Roxana, and his young son and heir, Alexander IV, were all murdered. The political empire he had built with the sword was destroyed by the swords of his own captains, and yet Alexander's vision did not die with him. While his political empire shattered, his cultural vision succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The Diadochi, for all their warring, established their own dynasties: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Persia, the Antigonids in Greece, and they ruled as Greek kings over eastern lands. The era they inaugurated, the Hellenistic period, was defined by the very cultural fusion that Alexander had championed. For the next 3 centuries, Greek became the common language of trade, government, and learning across the vast territories he had conquered. Greek art, architecture, philosophy, and science spread eastward, where they mingled with ancient local traditions to create new, vibrant, and syncretic cultures, such as Greco-Buddhism in Central Asia. The cities he founded, especially Alexandria, became the thriving intellectual and commercial centers of this new Hellenistic world, preserving and advancing knowledge that would profoundly influence the Roman Empire and, centuries later, the Islamic Golden Age and the European Renaissance. In the end, Alexander's true and lasting empire was not one of borders on a map, but an empire of the mind. He connected East and West in a way no one had before, creating a shared cultural landscape and a network of trade and ideas that fundamentally reshaped the course of human history. The political entity was fleeting, but the cultural one was enduring. Perhaps he understood this in his final moments. According to one legend, his final wish was a profound reflection on the nature of power and legacy. When my casket is being carried to the grave, he is said to have commanded, "Leave my hands hanging outside, for empty-handed I came into this world, and empty-handed I shall go." The man who conquered the world could take none of it with him, but the vision he left behind of a connected, cosmopolitan world outlived him, his generals, and the very empire he fought so hard to build. Thank you for watching the entire video. If you find it useful, please like and subscribe to the channel to follow Alexander the Great's thoughts.